The thunder crashed like cannon fire across the Arizona territory, each bolt of lightning turning the desert night into a hellscape of shadow and silver. Sarah McKenna jolted awake in her narrow bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as rain lashed the adobe walls of her isolated ranch house. For a moment she thought the sound that had torn her from sleep was just another rumble of the storm. Then it came again, a desperate rhythmic pounding on her front door that spoke of life and death urgency. No one came to the McKenna ranch after dark, not anymore. Not since Tom had died 6 months ago, leaving her alone in this godforsaken stretch of desert 20 miles from the nearest settlement. The smart thing would be to grab the Winchester rifle propped beside her bed and wait for whoever it was to move on. But the pounding continued, relentless and desperate, punctuated now by what sounded like a baby's weak cry. Sarah's bare feet hit the cold floor as she reached for her robe. Her hand found the rifle's familiar weight, and she moved through the small house like a ghost, every sense alert. The pounding came again, softer now, as if the person on the other side was losing strength. "Please," came a voice through the thick door, barely audible above the storm. "My son, he dies." The voice was deep, distinctly masculine, but what stopped Sarah's breath was the perfect English, tinged with an accent she couldn't quite place. Against every instinct for self-preservation, she found herself reaching for the heavy wooden bar that secured her door. "Step back," she called out, raising the rifle. "I'm armed." "I know," came the reply, weary and resigned. "You should be." Sarah lifted the bar and pulled the door open just wide enough to peer out. What she saw in the next lightning flash would be burned into her memory forever. A tall figure wrapped in a rain-soaked blanket, long black hair plastered to his head, and in his arms a tiny bundle that moved weakly. An Apache warrior stood on her doorstep, blood mixing with rainwater as it dripped from a gash on his forehead, and cradled against his chest was the smallest baby Sarah had ever seen. "Sweet Mother of God," she breathed, lowering the rifle. The man swayed on his feet, his dark eyes meeting hers with a desperation that transcended the centuries of conflict between their peoples. "Please, Senora, I have nowhere else to go. My son, he has not eaten in 3 days. His mother—" The warrior's voice cracked. "His mother is dead." Sarah's practical mind screamed warnings, Apache danger, death, but her eyes were fixed on the tiny infant whose weak cries were barely audible above the storm. The baby's skin had a grayish pallor, even in the flickering light, and his little fists moved with the feeble desperation of approaching starvation. Without conscious thought, Sarah pulled the door woody open. "Get inside, quickly." The warrior stumbled across the threshold, water streaming from his clothes onto her scrubbed wooden floor. In the lamplight, Sarah could see him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with the lean build of a man accustomed to hardship. His face bore the distinctive features of his people, high cheekbones, an aquiline nose, and those compelling dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of pain. But it was his clothing that surprised her most. Beneath the soaked blanket he wore not traditional Apache dress, but a white cotton shirt and dark trousers, as if he'd stepped from a mission school rather than a war party. "You speak English well," Sarah observed, setting her rifle aside but keeping it within reach. "I learned at the mission school in Tucson," he replied, gently adjusting the bundle in his arms. "My name is Ayana. In your language it means eternal blossom, though I think perhaps cursed wanderer would be more fitting." His mouth twisted in bitter irony. "I was given the Christian name Gabriel, but I cast that aside when I cast aside everything else they tried to teach me about forgiveness." Sarah studied his face, seeing intelligence and education warring with grief and desperation. "My name is Sarah McKenna. This is my ranch." She gestured toward the tiny infant. May I see him?" Ayana hesitated, then carefully pulled back a corner of the blanket. The baby was beautiful in the way all infants are, but Sarah's heart clenched at his obvious weakness. His skin was pale brown, suggesting mixed heritage, and his features held hints of both Apache and Hispanic ancestry. Most heartbreaking of all were his eyes, dark like his father's, but dulled with hunger and exhaustion. "He's so thin," Sarah whispered, her maternal instincts overriding years of frontier caution. What happened to his mother? Ayana's jaw tightened, and for a moment Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the rage beneath. "Cavalry patrol, 3 days ago. They said they were looking for renegades, but they found only women and children in our camp. Paloma, my wife, she tried to run with our son. A soldier's bullet found her back." The simple words carried such weight of grief that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said inadequately. "No parent should have to—" "She was Mexican," Ayana continued as if he hadn't heard her. "The daughter of a wealthy rancher near Sonora. We met when I was scouting for the army before I understood their true nature. Before I learned that to them we are all the same, all enemies to be destroyed." His arms tightened protectively around his son. "Paloma's father disowned her when she married me. My people cast me out for marrying outside the tribe. Our son belongs nowhere to no one but me." Sarah's mind raced. A half Apache, half Mexican baby whose parents had been rejected by both cultures. No wonder the warrior was desperate. "He needs milk," she said practically. "I don't have a cow, but I have goat's milk. It's not ideal, but—" "Senora." Ayana interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You do not understand. He will not take goat's milk. We tried. He grows weaker each day. He needs—" The proud warrior's voice broke. "He needs a woman's milk, a mother's milk. I have searched for 3 days, finding only closed doors and rifles pointed at my heart." The implications of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She understood now why he'd been so desperate, why he'd risked coming to an isolated ranch in the middle of a storm. He wasn't just asking for charity, he was asking for something that required a level of trust and intimacy that few white women would consider with an Apache warrior. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her own breast, where the familiar ache of unused milk reminded her of what she'd lost. 6 months ago, she'd given birth to a son who'd lived only 3 days, just long enough for her milk to come in, just long enough for her to understand the devastating love of motherhood before it was torn away. Tom had died in the mining accident before he'd even known about the pregnancy, leaving her to face the double grief alone. "You've recently lost a child," Ayana said, quietly reading something in her expression. "The Great Spirit has a cruel sense of balance, perhaps. I have a son with no mother to feed him, and you have milk with no child to give it to." Sarah finished, her voice barely a whisper. They stood facing each other in the lamplight, the storm raging outside, two people brought together by loss and desperation. The baby's weak cry broke the silence, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the grief that had held her heart in ice for months. "Let me see him again," she said. Ayana moved closer, pulling the blanket away from the infant's face. In the warmer light, Sarah could see the baby more clearly. His features were delicate but perfectly formed, his skin a warm honey color that spoke of his mixed heritage. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were the dark brown of fresh earth after rain. "What's his name?" Sarah asked. "Paloma called him Estrelita, Little Star. She said he would light our way through dark times." Ayana's voice was soft with memory. "I call him by his Apache name, Cocopelli Chata, Dancing Star." Sarah reached out tentatively, and Ayana, after a moment's hesitation, allowed her to touch the baby's cheek. His skin was paper-thin and cold, and she could feel his weakness like a physical weight. "How long since he last fed?" "Yesterday morning. A Mexican woman in a settlement to the south. She took pity and gave him some milk, but her husband found out, and—" Ayana touched the gash on his forehead. "They made their feelings clear." Sarah's heart broke for this child caught between worlds, wanted by none except his desperate father. She thought of her own lost son, of the milk that still came, despite having no child to nourish, of the empty ache in her arms that never seemed to heal. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll help him." Ayana's eyes widened with desperate hope. "You will?" "I'll nurse him," Sarah confirmed, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But first let me tend to that wound on your head, and we need to get you both warm and dry." For a moment the Apache warrior's careful control cracked, and Sarah saw naked gratitude in his face. "Senora McKenna, there are no words in English or Apache for what this means." "There don't need to be," Sarah replied, already moving toward her medical supplies. "A child is hungry, a mother has milk. Everything else is just politics." As she gathered clean cloths and herbal remedies, Sarah's mind began to work through the practical implications of what she'd just agreed to. Housing an Apache warrior and his child even temporarily would be seen as treason by most of her neighbors. The cavalry patrols would shoot first and ask questions later if they found Ayanna here. She was risking everything, her reputation, her safety, possibly her life. But as she glanced back at the warrior carefully bouncing his weak son trying to soothe the infant's feeble cries, Sarah found she didn't care about the risks. For the first time in 6 months, her body would serve its intended purpose. For the first time since Tom's death, she felt truly needed. "Sit down," she instructed Ayanna, gesturing to one of her wooden chairs. "Let me clean that cut before you bleed all over my floor." Ayanna obeyed, settling carefully with his son still cradled against his chest. Up close, Sarah could see the full extent of his exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly, whether from cold fatigue or blood loss she couldn't tell. "You've been running for 3 days?" she asked, dabbing at the gash with a clean cloth. "Running, hiding, searching," Ayanna confirmed. "The cavalry has been pursuing me since the raid. They blame me for the deaths of 2 soldiers, though I was trying to protect women and children, not fight." Sarah paused in her ministrations. "You killed soldiers." "One," Ayanna admitted without remorse. "The one who shot Paloma. The other died when his horse threw him after I startled it. But they will not make such distinctions." The casual way he spoke of killing should have terrified Sarah, but instead she found herself thinking of her own Tom, dead in a mind collapse that might not have been entirely accidental. Sometimes violence was the only response to violence. "There," she said, finishing with his wound. "That should heal cleanly. Now let me—" She hesitated suddenly, uncertain. "I'll need to prepare for the baby." Ayanna nodded, understanding. "I will wait." Sarah retreated to her bedroom, her hands shaking as she removed her nightdress and wrapper. It had been months since she'd thought of her body as anything other than a vessel for grief, but now, as she prepared to nourish another woman's child, she felt a strange mix of purpose and fear. When she returned to the main room wearing only a loose chemise and robe, she found Ayanna pacing slowly, the baby's cries growing weaker. He looked up as she entered, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the intimacy they were about to share, born of necessity, but profound nonetheless. "Here," Sarah said, settling into her rocking chair and arranging her robe. "Bring him to me." Ayanna approached slowly, reverently, as if he were bringing an offering to an altar. When he placed the tiny infant in Sarah's arms, she felt the familiar weight of a baby, the instinctive way her body curved to cradle him. Little Star Estrelita felt impossibly fragile, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Shh, little one," Sarah murmured, adjusting her chemise. "Let's see if we can help you." The baby's response was immediate and heartbreaking. At the first touch of nourishment, he latched on with desperate hunger, his tiny fists grasping at Sarah's chemise. The sensation sent a shock through her entire body. Physical relief as her engorged breasts finally found their purpose, part emotional healing as the empty ache in her arms began to fill. "Dios mío," Ayanna breathed, sinking to his knees beside the chair. "He feeds." Sarah looked down at the baby, watching color slowly return to his pale cheeks as he nursed. "He's strong," she said softly. "Stronger than he looks. Look how he holds on." Tears ran openly down Ayanna's face as he watched his son feeding the first real nourishment the child had received in days. "Paloma would have loved you," he said quietly. "She always said that kindness was a language that needed no translation." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the storm still raging outside, but the atmosphere inside the small adobe house somehow peaceful despite the circumstances. Sarah found herself studying Ayanna's profile, noting the way exhaustion and relief warred in his features. "Where were you planning to go?" she asked eventually. After you found someone to feed him." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. "I had not thought beyond this moment," he admitted. "Perhaps Mexico, where his mother's blood might afford him some protection. Perhaps deeper into Apache territory, though my own people may not welcome a half-breed child." His voice turned bitter. "The world has no place for those who belong to more than one people." "That's not true," Sarah said firmly. "America is supposed to be a place for everyone. That's what Tom always said, that the frontier was where a person could become whatever they chose to be regardless of where they came from." "Your husband was an optimist," Ayanna observed. "The reality is harsher. A man with my face and this child's mixed blood will find few open doors. Sarah shifted the baby slightly, noting how much stronger his suckling had become. Tell me about your wife. What was she like? Ayana's expression softened. Beautiful, but not just in her face. She had a spirit that could not be broken even when her family rejected her. She learned Apache ways, lived with my people for 3 years without complaint. She said that love was worth any sacrifice. His voice cracked. I think she was wrong. No love is worth leaving a child orphaned. She didn't leave him orphaned, Sarah pointed out. She left him with a father who loves him enough to risk everything for his survival. That's not abandonment, that's the greatest gift a mother can give. Before Ayana could respond, a new sound cut through the storm, the distant thunder of hoofbeats growing rapidly closer. Both adults froze their eyes, meeting in shared alarm. Cavalry, Ayana said, rising to his feet with fluid grace. They have found me. Sarah's mind raced. The baby was still nursing, nowhere near finished and far too weak to be moved. But if soldiers found an Apache warrior in her house... The root cellar, she said quickly. Behind the kitchen there's a trapdoor. You can hide there until... No. Ayana's voice was firm. I will not cower like a frightened rabbit while you face soldiers' questions. If they are here, it is because they tracked me to your door. You are already in danger because of me. The hoofbeats were closer now, definitely multiple riders approaching fast. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change everything. Then we face them together, she said, adjusting her robe to better cover herself in the nursing baby. You're my hired hand. Your wife died of fever and I've been helping with the baby out of Christian charity. Can you play that role? Ayana stared at her in amazement. You would lie to soldiers for me. I would lie to the devil himself for this child. Sarah replied fiercely, surprising herself with her vehemence. He's done nothing wrong except be born into a world that doesn't want him. The sound of horses reached the yard, followed by shouted commands and the jingle of military gear. Heavy boots approached the door, and Sarah's heart hammered as she tried to think of a convincing story. The pounding that came was different from Ayana's desperate knocking. This was the imperious demand of authority, expecting instant compliance. Open up military patrol. Sarah looked at Ayana, who nodded grimly and moved to stand slightly behind her chair, close enough to protect her, but positioned like a hired man rather than a warrior. The transformation was remarkable. Somehow he made himself smaller, less threatening, though Sarah could see the coiled tension in his muscles. Coming? She called, rising carefully with the baby still latched to her breast. She wrapped her robe more securely around herself, and the child then moved to open the door. 4 cavalry soldiers stood on her small porch, their blue uniforms dark with rain. Their leader was a tall man with a captain's insignia and cold gray eyes that reminded Sarah unpleasantly of a snake. Behind him, 3 younger soldiers waited with hands resting casually on their sidearms. Ma'am, the captain said, touching his hat brim but not removing it. Captain Robert Thorne, 2nd Cavalry. We're tracking a dangerous Apache renegade through this area. Have you seen anything suspicious? Sarah's mouth went dry, but she forced her voice to remain steady. Good evening, Captain. I'm Sarah McKenna. What kind of suspicious activity are you referring to? Thorne's eyes swept past her into the house, noting Ayana's presence immediately. Apache buck about 6 feet tall, traveling with a baby. He's wanted for murdering 2 soldiers. His gaze fixed on the bundle in Sarah's arms. That your child, ma'am? This baby belongs to my hired man, Sarah replied, gesturing toward Ayana. His wife died recently and I've been helping care for the child. Thorne stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ayana more carefully. Mighty dark for a hired hand, isn't he? And that's definitely an Apache bastard he's holding. The crude language sent a spike of anger through Sarah, but she kept her voice level. Gabriel is half Mexican, she said, using Ayana's Christian name and praying he wouldn't react. His wife was Spanish. The baby takes after his mother's family. Gabriel, is it? Thorne's smile was thin and dangerous. That's a Christian name for a heathen savage. Ayana stepped forward slightly, his posture deferential, but his eyes burning with controlled fury. I was educated at the mission school in Tucson, Captain. I have worked for Senora McKenna for several months, helping with her cattle and horses. Thorne studied him intently, and Sarah held her breath. Up close, despite Ayana's Western clothing and perfect English, his Apache heritage was unmistakable. The captain was clearly suspicious, but seemed uncertain. Several months, you say? Thorne's tone was casual, but Sarah sensed a trap. Then you were here when Thomas McKenna died in that mining accident. Sarah's blood chilled. How did this stranger know about Tom's death? And why did his tone suggest it hadn't been an accident at all? Yes, Captain, Ayanna replied smoothly. A terrible tragedy. Senor McKenna was a good man. Indeed he was. Thorne agreed, his cold eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Some might say too good, too honest for his own welfare. He paused meaningfully, especially when it came to certain business arrangements. The implication was clear, though Sarah didn't understand it. Captain Thorne knew something about Tom's death, something that suggested it hadn't been the accident everyone believed. I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning, Captain, Sarah said carefully. Thorne smiled again, the expression never reaching his eyes. Oh, I think you understand more than you're letting on, Mrs. McKenna. Your husband discovered something he shouldn't have, didn't he? Something that made certain people very nervous. Behind him, one of the younger soldiers shifted restlessly. Captain, shouldn't we be searching for the Apache every minute we waste? We're not wasting time, Corporal, Thorne cut him off sharply. We're being thorough. He turned back to Sarah. You see Mrs. McKenna, the Apache? We're hunting killed 2 of my men 3 days ago. I take that very personally, and I'm not leaving this area until I find him. The baby in Sarah's arms had finished nursing and was beginning to fuss. She shifted him slightly, trying to calm him, while her mind raced through the implications of Thorne's words. This man wasn't just hunting Ayanna. He had some connection to Tom's death, some agenda that went beyond military duty. I wish I could help you, Captain, she said. But as you can see, we're just trying to care for a motherless child. Perhaps you could check with the settlements to the south. Oh, we will, Thorne assured her. We'll be checking everywhere, very thoroughly. He stepped back slightly, but made no move to leave. Tell me, Mrs. McKenna, have you given any thought to what you'll do with this ranch now that your husband is gone? It's a lot of land for a woman to manage alone. The threat in his words was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah's grip tightened on the baby as she realized this encounter was about much more than hunting an Apache warrior. I manage just fine, thank you. I'm sure you do. For now. Thorne's gaze swept over her property with proprietary interest. But winter's coming and Apache raids are increasing. A woman alone, especially one harboring questionable elements, might find herself in serious danger. Ayanna had gone very still beside her, and Sarah could practically feel the violence coiled in his muscles. One wrong word from Thorne and the captain would discover exactly how dangerous an Apache warrior could be. Gabriel has been a great help, Sarah said firmly. I feel quite safe with him here. Gabriel? Thorne repeated his tone, making the name sound like a curse. Well, Gabriel, I hope you understand your responsibilities to your employer. Protecting white women and children is a sacred duty. Wouldn't you agree? Si, Capitan. Ayanna replied, his accent thicker now, playing the role of a subservient hired man. I would die before allowing harm to come to Senora McKenna or any child in her care. I'm sure you would, Thorne said, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. The thing is, Gabriel, my Apache friend, disappeared right around here. Our tracker is certain. So either he's hiding somewhere very close, or... He let the implication hang in the air. The baby chose that moment to let out a healthy cry, strong and demanding proof of the nourishment he'd received. The sound seemed to cut through the tension, reminding everyone present of what truly mattered. The child needs his rest, Sarah said, using the baby's cry as an excuse to step back. Surely your search can continue in the morning when the weather clears. Thorne studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. Of course. We'll make camp nearby and resume tracking at first light. His smile was sharp as a knife blade. Sweet dreams, Mrs. McKenna. I have a feeling tomorrow will be a very interesting day. As the soldiers mounted their horses and rode away into the storm, Sarah closed and barred the door with shaking hands. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did she turn to face Ayanna. He knows, she said quietly. He knows who you are. Ayanna nodded grimly. And you heard what he said about your husband. This Captain Thorne has secrets of his own. Sarah looked down at the baby in her arms, now sleeping peacefully after his first real meal in days. In the space of one night, her quiet, grief-stricken existence had been shattered. She was now harboring a fugitive Apache warrior nursing his half-breed son and apparently caught in some larger conspiracy involving her husband's death. The smart thing would be to ask Ayanna to leave immediately to distance herself from trouble before it consumed her. But as she watched little Star sleep, his tiny hand curled around her finger, Sarah knew she couldn't abandon him. Not now, not ever. "We need to leave," Ayanna said quietly. "Tonight, before Thorn returns with more men, I will not let you suffer from my presence." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Running will only confirm his suspicions. Besides, the baby isn't strong enough to travel yet. He needs regular feeding for at least another day or two." And then Sarah met his dark eyes, seeing her own determination reflected there. "Then we figure out what Captain Thorn knows about my husband's death. Something tells me your troubles and mine are connected." Outside, lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the desert like the drums of war. The storm was far from over, and Sarah suspected the tempest in her own life was just beginning. But for the first time since Tom's death, she felt alive again, driven by purpose stronger than grief. She had a child to protect, a warrior to trust, and a mystery to unravel. The frontier had always been dangerous for those brave enough to call it home, but Sarah McKenna was discovering that some things were worth any risk. As she settled back into her rocking chair with little Star, she caught Ayanna watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude was there, certainly, but something deeper as well, a recognition of the choice she'd made and what it meant. "Thank you," he said simply. "For my son's life. For mine." "Thank me when we're all safe," Sarah replied, but her voice was gentle. "This is just the beginning." The storm raged on outside, but inside the small adobe house an unlikely family had begun to form. A white widow, an Apache warrior, and a mixed-blood baby who belonged nowhere but had found sanctuary in the space between two wounded hearts. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, fresh challenges, and the unraveling of secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. But tonight there was peace in the simple act of feeding a hungry child, hope in the possibility of redemption, and the first stirrings of something that might in time become love. The frontier demanded everything from those who dared to claim it, but it also offered the rarest of gifts, the chance to become more than what you were to forge, bonds stronger than blood, and to discover that sometimes the family you choose is worth more than the one you're born into. As little Star nursed and Ayanna kept watch by the window, Sarah allowed herself to believe that perhaps against all odds they might just survive what was coming. After all, she'd already faced the worst thing imaginable, the loss of her own child. Everything else was just another kind of storm to weather. And Sarah McKenna was learning that she was much stronger than she'd ever imagined. Dawn broke over the Arizona territory with deceptive serenity, the storm's fury spent and replaced by crystalline air that made every distant mesa stand out in sharp relief. Sarah McKenna had not slept. She sat in her rocking chair, the Apache baby still cradled in her arms, watching Ayanna keep silent vigil by the window. Every few hours, little Star had stirred and nursed again, each feeding bringing more strength to his tiny body and more purpose to Sarah's wounded heart. "They are still out there," Ayanna said quietly, his voice barely disturbing the morning stillness. "3 men watching the house. The captain is clever. He leaves obvious guards to make us think we know where all his soldiers are." Sarah shifted the baby slightly, marveling at how much stronger he felt already. His skin had lost that grayish pallor, and his breathing was deep and regular. "How many do you think there really are?" "A full patrol. 12, maybe 15 men." Ayanna's profile was carved granite against the window. "But they are not all soldiers. Some wear civilian clothes, hired men perhaps." The implications sent a chill through Sarah. Captain Thorn wasn't just hunting an Apache renegade. He was conducting some kind of military operation with civilian support. The questions about Tom's death suddenly took on more sinister meaning. "Tell me about your wife," Sarah said, partly to distract herself from worry, and partly because she genuinely wanted to know about the woman whose child she was now nursing. "How did you meet her?" Ayanna's rigid posture softened slightly. "I was 19 working as a scout for the army. My Apache name means eternal blossom, but the soldiers called me Gabriel. They said it was easier to pronounce. I thought I was helping bring peace between my people and yours." His laugh was bitter. Such foolishness. There can be no peace when one side wants only the other's extinction. But you met her during this time, in Tucson. Her father, Don Carlos Mendoza, owned vast ranches on both sides of the border. Paloma had been educated in Mexico City. She spoke 4 languages, could read Latin, played piano like an angel. She was everything I was not: cultured, refined, born to privilege. Ayanna's voice grew soft with memory. She was also the kindest person I have ever known. Sarah found herself picturing a beautiful, educated Mexican woman choosing love over security, family over social standing. What made her fall in love with you? She said I was the first person who ever spoke to her about ideas instead of just her beauty. We would sit in her father's garden for hours discussing philosophy, religion, the future of our peoples. She believed that love could bridge any divide. His voice cracked slightly. I wanted to believe it too. The baby stirred in Sarah's arms, making soft sounds as he began to wake. She adjusted her position, preparing to nurse him again, and noticed Ayanna's grateful expression. Your husband, he said. Tell me about him. How did he die? Sarah hesitated. She'd never spoken to anyone about her suspicions regarding Tom's death, partly because they'd seemed too outlandish, partly because she'd had no one to confide in. But something about Ayanna's presence, his own experience with loss and injustice, made her want to share the burden. Tom was a miner, she began slowly, but not the usual kind. He had formal training as a geologist from back east. He could read rock formations like other men read books. 6 months ago, he was excited about something he'd found in the mountains north of here. He said it was bigger than anything he'd ever seen. Gold. I thought so at first. But the night before he died, he seemed frightened. He told me to be careful to trust no one if anything happened to him. He made me promise to hide something for him. Sarah glanced toward the kitchen, where a loose floorboard concealed Tom's final surveying notes. The next morning, they brought him home on a stretcher. Cave-in, they said. Just one of those things that happens in mining. Ayanna turned from the window to study her face. But you do not believe it was an accident? Tom knew every inch of those tunnels. He'd been working that particular claim for months. He would never have gone into an unstable section alone. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she voiced suspicions she'd kept buried for months. And there were boot prints around the entrance that didn't match his. Someone else was there. Did you tell the authorities? Sarah's laugh was bitter. The territorial marshal was very sympathetic, very understanding. He also mentioned that a woman alone might find it difficult to maintain such an isolated ranch, that there were men who would be happy to help her relocate. She looked down at Little Star, who was nursing contentedly. I think they all expected me to sell and leave. When I didn't, they seemed surprised. Because they want your land. Or what's under it. Sarah met his dark eyes. I think Tom found something worth killing for, and I think Captain Thorne knows what it was. Before Ayanna could respond, the baby in Sarah's arms suddenly tensed and began to cry. Not the weak mewling of starvation, but a strong, healthy wail that spoke of energy and life. The transformation was remarkable. In less than 12 hours, Little Star had gone from a dying infant to a vigorous baby who could make his needs known. He sounds like a warrior already, Ayanna said with pride, moving closer to look at his son. Paloma always said he had strong lungs. He's beautiful, Sarah said honestly, studying the baby's face as he nursed. His eyes are just like yours, but he has his mother's mouth. She paused, struck by a sudden thought. Ayanna, what did Paloma's father do when she married you? You said he disowned her, but he did more than that. Ayanna's expression darkened. Don Carlos Mendoza is not a man who accepts defiance, especially from women. When Paloma chose me over the wealthy Mexican rancher he had selected for her, he declared her dead to him. But that was not enough. He sent word to the Apache leaders that his daughter had betrayed her family's honor, hoping they would cast me out as well. Did they? Eventually. We lived with my band for 3 years, but there were always whispers, always those who questioned whether a mixed marriage could bring anything but trouble. When Paloma became pregnant, some of the elders said the child would be cursed, belonging to neither world. Ayanna's fists clenched. I should have taken her to Mexico, found a place where we could live in peace. Instead, I let pride keep us in Apache territory, thinking I could prove them wrong. The baby had finished nursing and was looking around with alert, bright eyes. Sarah lifted him to her shoulder, patting his back gently, as Tom had shown her with their own brief child. The familiar motions brought both comfort and pain. "You couldn't have known the cavalry would attack," Sarah said softly. "You were trying to build a life for your family. A life built on the graves of my wife and the rejection of both our peoples," Ayanna replied bitterly. "What kind of father does that make me? The kind who risks everything to save his son's life," Sarah said firmly. "The kind who swallows his pride to beg milk from a stranger. That takes more courage than any warrior's deed." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving at a steady pace rather than the urgent gallop of pursuit. Ayanna was at the window. Instantly, his body coiled for action. "4 riders," he reported. "Not soldiers, civilians well armed." Sarah's heart sank. "More of Thorne's men?" "I do not think so. These men ride like vaqueros, not hired guns." Ayanna's voice held a note of surprise. "And the lead rider? Dios mío, it cannot be." "What is it?" "The horse. That is Paloma's mare Estrella. I would know her anywhere." Ayanna's face had gone pale. "Someone who knew my wife is coming." The riders drew closer, and Sarah could make out more details. The leader was an older man with silver hair and an expensive Mexican saddle. His clothing spoke of wealth and authority, and the 3 men with him had the hard look of professional gunmen. "Don Carlos Mendoza," Ayanna breathed. "Paloma's father." Sarah felt little Star tense in her arms, as if sensing the sudden tension in the room. "He's come for the baby." "He declared Paloma dead when she married me," Ayanna said, his voice sharp with anger. "He has no claim to her son." "He's a wealthy Mexican rancher with private army," Sarah pointed out practically. "Legal claims may not matter to him." The riders had reached the yard now, and the older man was dismounting with the fluid grace of someone decades younger. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the family resemblance. This was where Paloma had gotten her aristocratic bearing, her fine bone structure. "Senora McKenna," the man called in accented English. "I am Don Carlos Mendoza. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Sarah and Ayanna exchanged glances. Whatever happened next would determine not just Little Star's fate, but possibly their own lives. "Stay back," Sarah told Ayanna. "Let me handle this." She moved to the door, still holding the baby, and opened it to face Paloma's father. Up close, Don Carlos was an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His dark eyes, so like his grandson's, swept over Sarah with calculating assessment. "Don Carlos," she greeted him formally. "I'm Sarah McKenna. What brings you to my ranch?" "You know why I'm here, Senora." His gaze fixed on the bundle in her arms. "I have come for my grandson, the child of my daughter Paloma." "I'm afraid I don't understand," Sarah replied carefully. "I was told that you disowned your daughter when she married." Don Carlos's face hardened. "Paloma made foolish choices that brought shame to our family. But a child is innocent of his parents' sins. He carries Mendoza blood, and that makes him my responsibility." "And his father?" Sarah asked pointedly. "Does he have no say in his son's future? The Apache dog who corrupted my daughter is dead," Don Carlos stated flatly. "Killed by cavalry 3 days ago along with Paloma. I've come to take the boy back to Mexico where he will be raised properly." Behind her, Sarah heard Ayanna's sharp intake of breath. Don Carlos believed his son-in-law was dead, which meant Ayanna's survival was still secret, at least from this quarter. "I'm sorry, but I cannot help you," Sarah said firmly. "This baby is in my care, and I won't turn him over to someone who denied his mother's existence." Don Carlos's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Senora, you do not understand the forces you are dealing with. I'm a man of considerable influence on both sides of the border. It would be unfortunate if you chose to obstruct me." One of his gunmen, a lean man with dead eyes, moved his hand closer to his weapon. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "And you don't understand frontier law," Sarah replied, surprised by her own courage. "This is American territory, not your Mexican hacienda. Your threats don't carry weight here." "Do they not?" Don Carlos smiled coldly. "I think you will find that money and influence cross borders more easily than you imagine. There are many ways to pressure a woman alone. The baby in Sarah's arms began to fuss, perhaps sensing the tension around him. Without thinking, she began to sway, gently soothing him with the natural motions of motherhood. Don Carlos's eyes sharpened as he noticed the practiced way she held the child. "You care for him well," he observed. "Perhaps we can reach an arrangement. I'm prepared to be generous to those who have helped my grandson in his time of need." "What kind of arrangement?" "Come with us to Mexico. Help me raise the boy properly. You would be well compensated given a position of honor in my household." His tone became persuasive, almost grandfatherly. "The child knows you now, trusts you. It would ease his transition." Sarah saw the trap immediately. Once in Mexico on Don Carlos's territory, she would have no protection, no recourse. She would be utterly dependent on his goodwill, and he had already demonstrated his capacity for cutting family ties when it suited him. "That's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but I have responsibilities here. My ranch, my life." "Your life?" Don Carlos's laugh was harsh. "What life, señora? A woman alone on a failing ranch with no family, no prospects. I offer you purpose, comfort, a chance to help raise a remarkable child." The accuracy of his assessment stung partly because it contained truth. Sarah's life had been empty since Tom's death, filled with grief and grinding daily survival. The past 12 hours caring for little Star had been the first time she'd felt truly alive in months. But she could also see the manipulation in Don Carlos's offer. He wanted to separate the baby from any connection to his Apache heritage, to erase Ayana's very existence from his grandson's life. "I need time to consider," Sarah said finally. "Time is a luxury we do not have," Don Carlos replied. "Every moment the boy remains in this dangerous territory increases the risk to his safety. Apache raids, cavalry patrols, lawless men. This is no place for a Mendoza heir." 2 days, Sarah insisted. "Give me 2 days to arrange my affairs." Don Carlos studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 2 days. But understand, señora, with or without your cooperation, I will take my grandson. It would be better for all concerned if you chose to help rather than hinder me." After the Mexicans rode away, Sarah closed and barred the door with shaking hands. She found Ayana sitting on the floor in the corner where he'd hidden during the confrontation, his head in his hands. "He thinks you're dead," Sarah said softly. "Perhaps it would be better if I were," Ayana replied without looking up. "Paloma's father has wealth power, the ability to give our son advantages I never could. In Mexico, little Star would be raised as a gentleman, educated, protected, and cut off from half his heritage," Sarah interrupted, "from any knowledge of his Apache father or the culture that shaped you." "What good is that heritage?" Ayana's voice was bitter. "It has brought him nothing but suffering. At least with the Mendozas he would be safe." Sarah sat down beside him, still holding the baby. "Is safety worth losing yourself? Because that's what Don Carlos is asking for. Little Star to become someone else entirely." "You heard him. He believes I am dead. If I remain dead to him, he will take the boy and disappear into Mexico. Estrellita will live, will grow up healthy and educated. Is that not what any father would want?" "Any father would want his son to know the truth about where he comes from," Sarah said firmly, "about the mother who died protecting him and the father who loved them both enough to risk everything." She looked down at little Star, who was gazing up at her with those dark, intelligent eyes. Already she could see hints of his personality emerging, the determined way he latched on when nursing, the alert way he studied faces, the strength in his tiny grip. "Besides," she added, "Don Carlos isn't offering little Star a choice. He's demanding surrender. There's a difference." Ayana finally looked up, and Sarah saw exhaustion and despair warring with something that might have been hope. "What do you suggest that I reveal myself to him, a Mexican Don who believes all Apaches are savages? I suggest we figure out what's really going on here." Sarah said, an idea beginning to form. Don Carlos arrived very quickly after the cavalry attack. How did he know about Paloma's death so soon? How did he track little Star here? Ayana frowned, considering. "You think there is a connection?" "I think there are too many coincidences. Thorne's patrol attacks your camp, you bring little Star here, and suddenly both the cavalry and your father-in-law show up at my ranch." Sarah shook her head. "Something doesn't add up." "What are you suggesting?" Sarah rose and moved to the kitchen, little Star still in her arms. Kneeling beside the stove, she pried up a loose floorboard and withdrew a leather portfolio Tom's final surveying notes and maps. "I think it's time we found out what my husband discovered in those mountains," she said, returning to Ayanna with the documents, "and why it's worth killing for." The maps were detailed, marked with Tom's careful notations in multiple colors. Sarah spread them on the table, pointing to a section marked with red ink. "This is where Tom was working when he died," she explained. "He'd marked several locations with symbols I don't understand." Ayanna studied the maps with the trained eye of a scout. "These symbols, they are Apache, sacred places mostly, but this one," he pointed to a mark near where Tom had been found. "This is the symbol for great wealth hidden below." Tom knew Apache writing. "Some miners learned it. The Apache have used these mountains for centuries. We know where water is, where the ground is stable, where valuable things might be found." Ayanna traced a line on the map. "But this location, it is very close to one of our most sacred places, the Canyon of Dancing Spirits." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What makes it sacred?" "Legend says it is where the Apache first received horses from the spirit world, but more recently," Ayanna's expression grew troubled, "there have been white men there, surveyors, miners, men with official papers claiming ownership of sacred land. Government men. Some, others wore civilian clothes but carried military equipment." Ayanna looked up from the maps. "Your husband was not the first to die for getting too close to their operations." The pieces were beginning to fit together in Sarah's mind. Government corruption, illegal mining claims, sacred Apache land being stolen and profited from. Tom had discovered something that threatened powerful people, and they'd killed him for it. "We need to get to that canyon," Sarah said decisively. "No." Ayanna's response was immediate and firm. "It is too dangerous. If you are right about your husband's death, then the men responsible are still out there. They will not hesitate to kill again." "Then we can't just sit here waiting for them to make the next move," Sarah argued. "Thorne is watching us. Don Carlos wants Little Star, and we're trapped between them. Our only chance is to find evidence of what's really happening." "And what of Estrelita? You would take a baby into such danger." Sarah looked down at the child in her arms, seeing not just Ayanna's son, but her own purpose, her own reason for fighting. "I think we're already in danger. At least this way we're moving forward, instead of just reacting." Ayanna was quiet for several minutes, studying the maps and considering their options. Finally, he nodded slowly. "There is wisdom in what you say, but if we do this, we do it carefully, like a hunting party, not a war party." "What's the difference?" "A war party announces itself, fights openly, accepts casualties for glory." Ayanna's smile was grim. "A hunting party is patient, invisible, deadly. It strikes only when success is certain." The baby had fallen asleep in Sarah's arms, exhausted by his feeding and the emotional tensions around him. She looked at his peaceful face and made a silent vow that whatever happened, Little Star would grow up knowing the truth about his parents, his heritage, and the courage it had taken to keep him alive. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tonight. The moon will be dark and Thorne's watchers will not expect us to move so soon." Ayanna began studying the maps more carefully, tracing possible routes. "But first, we must prepare. Food, water, weapons, and a way to keep Estrelita safe during travel. I have a pack cradle that Tom made for—" Sarah's voice caught. "For our son. It will keep Little Star secure and quiet." They spent the remainder of the day in careful preparation. Sarah gathered supplies while Ayanna scouted the watchers' positions, memorizing their routines and identifying the best escape route. As evening approached, she found herself experiencing a mixture of terror and excitement she hadn't felt since her wedding day, the sense of stepping into an unknown future that would change everything. "Are you certain about this?" Ayanna asked as they made final preparations. "Once we leave, there will be no going back. Your life here, your ranch, it will all be forfeit." Sarah looked around the small adobe house that had been her home, her refuge, her prison. She thought of Tom, of their lost child, of the months of grief and isolation that had nearly consumed her. Then she looked at Little Star, sleeping peacefully in the pack cradle, and felt her heart expand with fierce protectiveness. "This place has been a tomb for me," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time to find out what it means to really live again." As darkness fell over the Arizona territory, Sarah McKenna prepared to leave behind everything she'd known for everything she hoped to become. The frontier had always demanded courage from those who dared to claim it, but tonight it was asking for something more: faith in the bonds that transcended blood, trust in unlikely allies, and the belief that some fights were worth any sacrifice. The hunt was about to begin, and Sarah intended to be predator rather than prey. Little Star deserved nothing less than the truth, and she was finally ready to fight for it. Outside, coyotes called across the desert night, their voices wild and free. Soon Sarah thought she would understand what they were singing about: the song of those who belonged to no one but themselves, who made their own rules in a land too vast and wild for civilization's narrow definitions. It was a song of freedom, and for the first time in her life, Sarah McKenna was ready to learn the words. The moon was a sliver of bone against the star-drunk Arizona sky when Sarah McKenna slipped from her house like a shadow. Little Star slept peacefully in the pack cradle strapped to her back, his tiny body warm against her spine. Every instinct screamed that she was making the worst mistake of her life, but her heart beat steady and strong with purpose she hadn't felt in months. Ayanna materialized from the darkness beside the barn, moving with the fluid silence that marked him as Apache, despite his mission school education. He'd painted his face with ash and clay and traditional patterns, transforming himself from Gabriel the hired hand back into a warrior of his people. "The Watchers," Sarah whispered. "Sleeping. I gave them help." His smile was grim in the starlight. "Peyote tea mixed with their coffee. They will wake with splitting heads and no memory of the night." "You drugged them. Better than killing them. Less noise, fewer questions." He shouldered a pack laden with supplies and weapons. "But it will not last long. We have perhaps 6 hours before Thorn realizes we are gone." They moved across the desert like ghosts, following game trails that only Ayanna's trained eyes could see in the darkness. Sarah had expected the journey to be difficult with a baby, but the pack cradle distributed Little Star's weight evenly, and his rhythmic breathing against her back was oddly comforting. "How far to the Canyon of Dancing Spirits?" she asked as they paused beside a rock formation to rest and check their bearings. 20 miles north. But we are not going there directly." Ayanna consulted the stars with the casual expertise of a people who had navigated by them for centuries. "First, we visit someone who may have answers about your husband's death." "Who?" "There is an old Apache woman, Grandmother Moon. She lives alone in the foothills, gathering herbs and speaking with spirits. White men think she is just a crazy old squaw, but she sees everything that happens in these mountains." His expression grew respectful. "She was also Paloma's friend. If anyone knows the truth about what happened to my wife and your husband, it is her." They traveled in companionable silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself marveling at how natural this felt, moving through the wilderness with a man she'd known less than 2 days, carrying his child, fleeing from dangers she barely understood. By all rights, she should be terrified. Instead, she felt more alive than she had since Tom's death. The first hint of dawn was touching the eastern peaks when Ayanna called a halt beside a small spring hidden among the rocks. The water was cold and sweet, fed by mountain snows, and Sarah gratefully refilled their canteens while Ayanna kept watch. Little Star had awakened with the sunrise, alert and hungry. Sarah found a sheltered spot among the boulders and began to nurse him, amazed again at how much stronger he'd grown in just 2 days. His grip was firm now, his eyes bright and curious as they tracked the movements around him. "He looks like his mother when he concentrates," Ayanna said, softly settling beside them with his rifle across his knees. Paloma had that same intensity, as if she could understand the world's secrets just by studying them carefully enough. "Tell me more about her," Sarah said. "What did she think about the conflicts between your peoples?" Ayanna was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes distant with memory. She believed that hatred was a choice, not a birthright. She used to say that every child born was a new chance for the world to be better than it was. He gestured toward his son. She hoped Estrelita would be a bridge between worlds, carrying the best of both peoples in his blood. "And you, what do you believe?" "I believed in her," Ayanna said simply, "in her vision of what could be. But after seeing her die, after watching hatred destroy everything beautiful," he shook his head, "I'm no longer certain that peace is possible." Sarah adjusted Little Star's position, thinking about her own losses, her own struggles with faith and hope. Maybe peace isn't something that just happens. Maybe it's something each generation has to choose to build one relationship at a time. Before Ayanna could respond, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed across the desert, followed immediately by the whine of a bullet striking rock inches from Sarah's head. She threw herself over Little Star protectively as Ayanna spun toward the sound, his own weapon rising. "Down!" he commanded, but Sarah was already moving, scrambling for better cover with the baby clutched against her chest. More shots rang out, coming from multiple directions. Through the morning air, Sarah could hear the thunder of approaching horses and the shouts of men closing in fast. "How did they find us so quickly?" she gasped. "Trackers," Ayanna replied grimly, returning fire at muzzle flashes among the rocks above them. "Better than I expected. Military trained, not just hired guns." A bullet chipped stone near Sarah's face, and she felt the sting of rock fragments against her cheek. Little Star had begun to cry, his wails echoing off the canyon walls and making their position even more obvious to the attackers. "We cannot stay here," Ayanna said, ejecting spent cartridges and reloading with practiced speed. "They have us surrounded." "Where can we go?" Ayanna pointed toward a narrow crack in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "That passage leads to a system of caves. If we can reach it—" Another volley of shots cut off his words. Sarah could see riders now, at least 8 men in cavalry uniforms mixed with civilians, all armed and moving to cut off their escape routes. "Sarah McKenna." Captain Thorne's voice carried clearly across the rocks. "You're harboring a dangerous fugitive. Surrender the Apache and the child and you won't be harmed." "Like hell," Sarah muttered, checking the small pistol Tom had taught her to use. 6 shots, not much against 8 armed men, but better than nothing. "Send out the boy," another voice called, older, accented with Spanish inflection. Don Carlos had arrived with reinforcements. "The child is innocent. Do not let the savage use him as a shield." Ayanna's face darkened with fury at the implication. Paloma's father thinks to claim moral authority while he hunts his own grandson like an animal. "Can we reach that passage?" Sarah asked, studying the distance between their position and the crack in the rock face. "Perhaps, but not both of us. Someone must cover the retreat." The meaning was clear. One of them would have to hold off the attackers while the other escaped with Little Star. It was a suicide mission, and they both knew it. "I'll stay," Sarah said immediately. "You take Little Star and go." "No," Ayanna's voice was absolute. "You are his lifeline now. Without you, he dies. I will not let my son starve because I was too cowardly to— Gabriel." The shout came from a new direction closer than the others. Sarah turned to see a figure emerging from behind a boulder, a young Apache warrior painted for war with a Winchester rifle in his hands. Ayanna stiffened in recognition. "Nyalnish, my brother." "Your brother." Sarah stared at the newcomer, seeing the family resemblance now that it was pointed out. "Half-brother? Son of the same father, different mothers?" Ayanna's voice held a complex mixture of emotions. "What are you doing here, Nyalnish?" The young warrior ignored the question, instead studying Sarah and the baby with intense dark eyes. "So this is the white woman who nurses our brother's son and the half-breed child our father has sent me to retrieve." Sarah's blood chilled. "Sent you?" The great chief Cochise grows old, but his wisdom remains sharp. Nyalnish continued, his English accented but clear. "He says a child who belongs to neither world will bring only suffering to both. Better that he should be raised as Apache, his white blood forgotten." "Another vulture circling," Sarah said bitterly. "First the cavalry wants him dead, then his grandfather wants to erase his Apache heritage. Now your people want to erase his white blood. Doesn't anyone care what's best for Little Star himself?" Nyalnish's expression shifted slightly, as if her words had struck an unexpected chord. "You speak boldly for a woman surrounded by enemies." "I speak honestly for a mother protecting her child," Sarah replied, surprised by her own courage. "Because that's what I am now, his mother in every way that matters." "His mother is dead," Nyalnish said quietly, "killed by the bluecoats you shelter with." "I'm not sheltering with anyone." Sarah's voice rose with anger and frustration. "I'm trying to keep an innocent baby alive while everyone else treats him like property to be claimed." The shooting had stopped during their exchange, but Sarah could hear horses moving closer, surrounding them more completely. Time was running out, and they were still trapped between multiple enemies. "Nyalnish," Ayanna said urgently, "you must know this is wrong. Estrelita belongs with his father, not stolen away to serve someone else's vision of what he should become. Does he? The young warrior's gaze was steady and challenging. Our father cast you out for your choice in marriage. You chose the white world over your people. Why should your son be any different? Because he shouldn't have to choose at all, Sarah interrupted. He should be free to be both Apache and Mexican and anything else he wants to be. That's what America is supposed to mean, the right to become whatever you're brave enough to try for. Naalnish studied her for a long moment, his painted face unreadable. Then to Sarah's amazement, he lowered his rifle. You have courage, white woman, perhaps too much for your own good. He turned to his half-brother. The bluecoats come from the south, the Mexican, and his hired guns from the north. There is a war party of our people approaching from the east. You are trapped with nowhere to run. Then why are you telling us this? Ayana asked suspiciously. Because Paloma was kind to me when others would not be. Because she believed, as you say, this woman believes that a child should not pay for his parents' choices. Naalnish's voice grew quiet. And because I have seen what the bluecoats do to mixed-blood children. They are not fit to live among them, but not Apache enough to be safe with us either. They become nothing, belonging nowhere. Sarah felt a spark of hope. You'll help us. I will give you a chance to help yourselves. There is another way out of this canyon known only to the Apache, but it requires crossing sacred ground, and the penalty for trespass by outsiders is death. More sacred than a child's life? Sarah asked. Naalnish almost smiled. Spoken like Paloma. Very well. Follow me, but know that if we are caught on the sacred path, I cannot protect you from my people's justice. The passage he led them to was hidden behind a screen of desert willows so narrow that Sarah had to turn sideways to squeeze through with Little Star on her back. Beyond lay a winding trail that seemed to lead directly into the heart of the mountain. Behind them, shouts indicated that their disappearance had been discovered. Within minutes, the pursuit would resume in earnest. How far? Ayana asked as they moved deeper into the mountain. 1 mile to the sacred canyon. From there, another 2 miles to safety. Naalnish moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who had traveled this path since childhood. But we must move quickly. The old grandmother will not wait if we are late. Grandmother Moon. She has been expecting you. She says the spirits told her of a white woman who would carry an Apache child into the sacred places. Naalnish's voice held a note of wonder. She is very old, very wise. If anyone can tell you the truth about your husband's death, it is her. They climbed steadily through passages that seemed carved by wind and water over countless centuries. The rock formations grew more fantastic as they ascended, twisted into shapes that seemed almost alive in the dancing shadows cast by their torch. Little Star had grown quiet during the climb, as if sensing the solemnity of the place they traveled through. Sarah found herself oddly moved by the experience, walking paths that had been sacred to Ayana's people for generations, carrying a child who represented the future both peoples might share if they could find wisdom enough to embrace it. Tell me about the Canyon of Dancing Spirits, she said, as they paused to rest at a widening in the passage. Long ago, when the world was young, the Apache had no horses. Naalnish began settling into the rhythm of an often-told tale. We hunted on foot, lived in poverty compared to the mounted tribes around us. But in that canyon, the spirits took pity on us. They danced with the wild horses, teaching them to accept Apache riders. It was there that we became the warriors we are today. And white men want to mine there. Not just mine. They want to build a railroad through the sacred places, bring in thousands of settlers, destroy everything that makes the land holy. Naalnish's voice grew hard. Your husband was the first to refuse to help them map our secrets. He paid with his life. Sarah felt a surge of pride in Tom's memory mixed with grief for what his integrity had cost him. How many others have died? More than you know. Apache, Mexican, white, anyone who stands in the way of their plans. Naalnish shouldered his pack again. Come, we are almost there. The passage opened suddenly onto a vista that took Sarah's breath away. They stood at the rim of a vast canyon, its walls painted in every shade of red and gold and purple that existed in nature. Far below, a stream meandered through cottonwoods and willows, their leaves bright green against the desert stone. But what made the place truly extraordinary were the rock formations that filled the canyon floor, spires and arches and balanced stones that seemed to defy gravity, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate design rather than random erosion. The dancing spirits. Ayana breathed. his voice filled with reverence. "I have not seen this place since I was a boy." "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, adjusting Little Star so he could see the view, "like a cathedral made of stone." "And there?" Na'Alnish pointed toward a thin column of smoke rising from among the formations below, "is Grandmother Moon." The descent was treacherous, following a trail so narrow and steep that Sarah had to concentrate completely on each step. But finally, they reached the canyon floor where the air was cooler and sweet, with the scent of water and growing things. The old woman who emerged from among the rock spires looked ancient as the stones themselves. Her face was seamed with wrinkles that spoke of a century of desert winds, her hair white as winter clouds. But her eyes were bright and alert, missing nothing as she studied the unlikely trio approaching her sanctuary. "So," she said in English only slightly accented with Apache pronunciation, "the white woman comes at last carrying the child of two worlds on her back and the heart of a warrior in her breast." Sarah felt strangely comforted by the old woman's presence, as if she'd finally found someone who might have answers to questions she'd barely known how to ask. "Grandmother Moon, I'm Sarah McKenna. I've come seeking the truth about my husband's death." "Truth." The old woman's laugh was like wind chimes in a desert breeze. "Truth is a dangerous thing, granddaughter. Men kill for it, die for it, sell their souls to hide from it. Are you certain you want to find it?" "I'm certain." Grandmother Moon nodded approvingly. "Good. Truth should be spoken even when it burns. Especially when it burns." She gestured toward a circle of stones arranged around a small fire. "Sit, feed the child. Let the men keep watch while we women talk of important things." As Sarah settled beside the fire and began to nurse Little Star, the old woman studied her with eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. "You have lost a child of your own." It wasn't a question. "Yes, 6 months ago. And your husband died seeking justice for his people, not knowing he carried new life in his wife's womb." Sarah's breath caught. "How do you—" "The spirits whisper many things to those who know how to listen." Grandmother Moon poked the fire with a gnarled stick. "Your Thomas was a good man, daughter. He came to me before he died seeking guidance about what he had discovered." "What did he find?" "Gold, more gold than has ever been seen in this territory, enough to make kings of common men." The old woman's expression grew dark. "But it lies directly beneath our most sacred places. To mine it, they would have to destroy everything that makes us Apache." Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "So they killed him to keep him quiet. They killed him because he refused to falsify his surveys. He would not say the sacred places were empty of minerals when he knew they were not. But neither would he help them steal what belonged to the Apache." Grandmother Moon's voice grew sad. An honest man caught between dishonest choices. Death was the only escape left to him. "Who killed him, Captain Thorne?" "Thorne is a snake, but he bites only when his masters command it. The real power lies with men in Washington, men who see this territory as nothing but resources to be harvested." The old woman leaned forward intently. "But there is proof, daughter. Your husband was not the only one to refuse their bribes. Others kept records, documented their crimes. If you could find these records—" "Where?" "In the canyon they want to destroy, hidden in the place where the spirits first danced with horses." Grandmother Moon's eyes grew distant. "But reaching it will require walking through fire. Many men want you dead now, child. You have become dangerous to their plans." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Na'Alnish appeared at the edge of their circle, his face grim with urgency. "Grandmother, we must go. The Bluecoats have found the sacred passage. They come with dynamite, threatening to blast their way through if we do not surrender the woman and child." "And my father's warriors?" "Surrounding the canyon. If the soldiers enter sacred ground, there will be war." Na'Alnish's voice was tight with tension. "Many will die." Grandmother Moon rose with surprising agility for her age. "Then it is time for the dance to begin again. Time for the spirits to choose who is worthy to remain in this place." She moved to a leather bag hanging from a wooden tripod with drawing items that glinted in the firelight. Sarah gasped as she recognized surveying instruments, a compass measuring devices, and most importantly, a leather journal bound with rawhide. "Your husband's final notes," the old woman said, handing the journal to Sarah. Everything he discovered, all the proof you need to expose their conspiracy. But first you must survive to use it. The sound of explosions echoed from the canyon walls as Thorne's men began blasting their way through the sacred passage. Sarah clutched the journal to her chest while Little Star began to cry, frightened by the noise. "There is another way out," Grandmother Moon said calmly, as if dynamite and approaching soldiers were everyday occurrences. "But it requires faith and courage and the willingness to trust in powers greater than human ambition." "What kind of way?" The old woman smiled, and suddenly Sarah could see the young woman she had once been: beautiful, strong, unafraid of any challenge. The way of the dancing spirit's granddaughter. The path that only opens for those who carry love, stronger than fear. As the explosions grew closer and the sounds of approaching conflict filled the sacred canyon, Sarah McKenna prepared to discover whether love truly could triumph over the forces arrayed against them. Little Star's life, Ayana's freedom, and the future of two peoples might all depend on her answer. The dance was about to begin, and Sarah intended to be worthy of her partner. The earth shook beneath Sarah's feet as another dynamite blast tore through the sacred canyon walls. Little Star's cries echoed off the ancient stones, his voice joining a chorus of outrage that seemed to rise from the very rocks themselves. Grandmother Moon stood at the center of it all, arms raised to the sky, chanting in Apache words that predated written history. "They desecrate the holy places," she called out, her voice carrying supernatural authority despite her advanced age. "Let the spirits judge who belongs in this sacred ground." Captain Thorne's voice boomed from the canyon entrance, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "This is your final warning. Send out the woman, the child, and the Apache fugitive, or we'll blast this entire canyon to rubble." "Empty threat," Nalnish said, grimly checking his Winchester. "He cannot destroy the gold he seeks to steal. But he can destroy us," Ayana pointed out, positioning himself where he could cover multiple approaches to their position among the rock spires. Sarah clutched Tom's journal to her chest while Little Star nursed frantically, as if sensing the danger around them. The leather-bound book contained everything: Tom's detailed surveys, proving the massive gold deposits, his correspondence documenting the government conspiracy, even names of officials involved in the illegal mining claims. "Grandmother," Sarah said urgently, "you mentioned another way out, where—" The old woman's eyes gleamed with ancient knowledge. "Not out, granddaughter. Through. The spirits have been waiting centuries for someone worthy to walk the path of dancing light." Before Sarah could ask what that meant, the sound of galloping horses echoed from the opposite end of the canyon. Don Carlos Mendoza appeared with a dozen mounted vaqueros, their weapons glinting in the morning sun. "Enough of this madness," the Mexican Don shouted. "I claim my grandson under international law. Any who interfere will answer to the Mexican government." "Your grandson is under Apache protection now," came a new voice, deep and commanding. A figure emerged from the rocks above, an elderly Apache chief with silver hair braided with eagle feathers, his weathered face bearing the dignity of absolute authority. Sarah felt Ayana stiffen beside her. "My father," he whispered. "Chief Cochise himself has come." The legendary Apache leader surveyed the scene below, with eyes that had witnessed decades of conflict. When he spoke, his English was perfect, each word weighted with the power of command. "I am Cochise, chief of the Chiricahua Apache. This canyon is sacred to my people. Any who bring violence here will face the judgment of the spirits." Captain Thorne emerged from the passage his men had blasted, flanked by a dozen soldiers with rifles ready. His face was flushed with anger and frustration. "I don't care if you're Geronimo himself. Old man, I have authority from Washington to arrest fugitives wherever I find them." "Washington has no authority in the spirit world," Cochise replied calmly. "And you have entered the realm of powers greater than any government." The standoff was electric with tension. 4 separate forces faced each other in the sacred canyon. Apache warriors positioned on the surrounding cliffs, cavalry soldiers at the blasted entrance, Mexican vaqueros holding the southern approach, and in the center, Sarah with Little Star, protected by Ayana, Nalnish, and Grandmother Moon. It was Don Carlos who broke the silence, spurring his horse forward into the circle of rock spires. "Enough of this mystical nonsense. I am here for one thing, my grandson." His cold eyes fixed on Sarah. "You have had your day of adventure, Senora. Now return the boy to his family." His family is right here, Sarah replied, rising to her feet with little Star in her arms. His father, who has risked everything for him, and the woman who has pledged her life to protect him. You are not his mother, Don Carlos said dismissively. You are a barren woman playing at motherhood with another's child. The cruel words hit Sarah like physical blows, but Ayanna was beside her instantly, his dark eyes blazing with fury. You dare speak so to the woman who saved my son's life, to the mother who gave him milk when no one else would. I speak truth. Don Carlos's voice rose with aristocratic outrage. This boy carries the blood of the Mendoza family. He will not be raised by savages and spinsters. And what of his Apache blood? Chief Cochise interjected, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. Does that count for nothing in your grand plans? Apache blood is a stain to be overcome, not celebrated, Don Carlos replied contemptuously. The boy will be educated properly in Mexico, taught civilized ways, made into a gentleman worthy of his mother's lineage. His mother chose love over your civilization, Naalnish said, his young voice shaking with controlled anger. She chose my brother over your golden cages. And look where it led her, Don Carlos gestured dramatically. Dead in the desert, her child starving, her husband an outcast from both worlds. Captain Thorne chose that moment to assert his authority, stepping forward with his sidearm drawn. This debate is over. I'm placing all of you under arrest for harboring a fugitive. His eyes fixed on Sarah with predatory intensity. Especially you, Mrs. McKenna. You've been harboring a dangerous criminal and interfering with military operations. What I've been doing, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word, is protecting an innocent child from men who see him as property to be claimed rather than a human being with rights of his own. Rights? Thorne laughed harshly. Half-breed bastards have no rights, and neither do traitors who side with Apache murderers over their own kind. The ugly words hung in the air like poison, and Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her, not just anger, but a crystalline clarity about what she was fighting for. My own kind, she repeated, her voice cutting across the canyon like a blade. You mean people like you, Captain? People who murder innocent men for finding inconvenient truths? Thorne's face went pale. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Sarah interrupted, pulling Tom's journal from her coat. I'm stating facts. Facts about how my husband was murdered for refusing to falsify surveys that would have let you steal Apache gold. She opened the journal, reading from Tom's careful notes. August 15th, 1873. Met with Captain Thorne and civilian contractors. Offered substantial payment to misrepresent mineral deposits in sacred Apache territory. Declined. Threats made against my safety and that of my wife. The color drained completely from Thorne's face. Where did you get that? From the woman your conspiracy tried to silence, Grandmother Moon said, stepping forward with supernatural calm. Thomas McKenna came to me before he died, seeking wisdom about what to do with dangerous knowledge. I told him to document everything, hide the proof where spirits could guard it. You're all lying, Thorne snarled, but his desperation was showing. That journal is a forgery, is it? Sarah continued reading. August 22nd, Thorne's civilian partner, identified as Marcus Webb, representing Eastern mining interests with government connections, discussed plans to declare Apache lands vacant through falsified geological reports. Don Carlos had gone very still, his aristocratic features tight with concentration. Marcus Webb, he said slowly. I know that name. He has approached me about mineral rights on my Mexican properties. Because the conspiracy crosses borders, Sarah said, pieces falling into place even as she spoke. They're not just stealing Apache land, they're creating an international mining operation with corrupt officials on both sides. Enough. Thorne raised his pistol toward Sarah, his military composure cracking completely. I won't let some half-breed loving whore destroy everything we've worked for. The shot that rang out came not from Thorne's weapon, but from Ayanna's rifle. The captain spun around, clutching his shoulder as his pistol flew from nerveless fingers. The next shot will not wound, Ayanna said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute promise of death. Chaos erupted in the canyon. Soldiers raised their weapons toward Ayanna. Apache warriors on the cliffs drew bows. Mexican vaqueros spurred their horses toward fighting positions. In seconds, the sacred canyon would become a battlefield. Stop! The voice that cut through the violence belonged to neither soldier nor warrior, but to Little Star himself, his healthy, strong cry rising above the sounds of impending war. Grandmother Moon raised her arms again, and somehow her presence commanded attention from all the armed men surrounding them. "The spirits speak through the child," she declared. "He calls for peace in this sacred place. Will you ignore the voice of innocence?" Chief Cochise spurred his horse forward, entering the circle of potential violence with the calm authority of a man who had faced death countless times. "My son," he said, looking directly at Ayanna, "you have wandered far from your people, but perhaps the path has led you where you needed to be. Father, you chose love over duty, family over tribe. I cast you out for this choice." Cochise's weathered face showed no emotion. "I was wrong." The simple admission sent shockwaves through the assembled Apache warriors. Chief Cochise admitting error was almost unprecedented. "A man who risks everything for his child's survival is not weak," the great chief continued. "A woman who gives her milk to feed another's baby is not foolish. These are strengths my people have forgotten in our rage against injustice." He turned his penetrating gaze on Sarah, studying her with the intensity of a judge weighing souls. "White woman, you carry an Apache child. Do you understand what this means?" "It means I love him," Sarah replied simply, "and I'll protect him with my life." "Love," Cochise repeated the word as if tasting something rare and precious. Paloma spoke of this often. She said love was a force stronger than tribal law, stronger than racial hatred. He paused, his ancient eyes reflecting deep thought. Perhaps it is time to test this theory. Don Carlos urged his horse closer, his face twisted with frustrated rage. "This is madness. You cannot leave a Mendoza heir to be raised by peasants and savages." "Can I not?" Cochise's voice carried subtle threat. "You speak of blood." "Don Carlos, tell me, what have you offered this child besides your name? What sacrifice have you made for his welfare?" "I offer him wealth, education, position in society. You offer him a cage made of gold," Sarah interrupted. "The same thing you offered Paloma. She chose freedom instead." "And died for her foolishness." "She died for her courage," Ayanna said fiercely. "She died protecting our son from men who would steal Apache children and raise them to be ashamed of their heritage. As you were ashamed." Don Carlos's smile was cruel. "Hiding among white men with a Christian name, denying your own people." The insult hit its mark, and Sarah saw Ayanna flinch. But it was Chief Cochise who responded, his voice like thunder rolling across stone. "My son learned the white man's ways to better understand the enemy. It was my command, not his shame, that sent him to their schools." The great chief's gaze swept over the assembled soldiers and vaqueros. "Perhaps all of you could benefit from such understanding." Captain Thorne, still clutching his wounded shoulder, made one last desperate play. "This is all very touching, but I still have orders from Washington that Apache is wanted for murdering federal soldiers." "Then perhaps Washington should answer for murdering Apache women and children," Nulnish said, stepping forward with his rifle trained on Thorne. "Perhaps we should discuss the unprovoked attack on a peaceful camp." "Peaceful?" Thorne laughed bitterly. "There are no peaceful Apaches, only savages waiting for their chance to kill." The racist words seemed to echo off the canyon walls, and Sarah felt Little Star tense in her arms, as if even he could sense the hatred being directed at his people. "You want to talk about savages?" Sarah said, her voice rising with righteous anger. "Let's talk about men who murder geologists for refusing to lie. Let's talk about soldiers who shoot women in the back. Let's talk about a government conspiracy to steal sacred land for private profit." She held up Tom's journal like a weapon. "Every name, every bribe, every illegal contract, it's all documented here, including your real orders, Captain. Not to arrest an Apache fugitive, but to silence anyone who could expose the gold conspiracy." Thorne's remaining composure shattered completely. "You have no idea what forces you're dealing with. Men more powerful than you can imagine. They'll destroy you all before they let you expose their operations." "Then let them try," said a new voice from the canyon entrance. Everyone turned to see a figure in a dusty suit picking his way through the rubble Thorne's men had blasted. He was a small, neat man with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, but he carried himself with quiet authority. "Judge Harrison Wells, Territorial Court," he announced, producing official papers from his coat. "I'm here to serve federal warrants." Thorne straightened hopefully. About time, Judge, I need you to arrest you. Wells interrupted calmly. Captain Robert Thorne, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, theft of government property, and violation of Apache treaty rights. The silence that followed was profound. Thorne's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, desperate calculation. This is impossible, he whispered. The orders came from Washington, my superiors. Your superiors included my investigation when evidence of corruption reached certain ears in the Capitol. Judge Wells replied. It seems someone sent copies of a murdered geologist's journal to some very important people. Sarah felt her heart race. Someone sent copies. How? An elderly Apache woman traveled to Tucson 3 months ago, Wells explained. She gave detailed testimony about government agents attempting to steal sacred lands. When we investigated, we found enough evidence to implicate officials at the highest levels. Grandmother Moon's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. The spirits told me the truth would find its way to honest men given time. Don Carlos had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. Judge, surely these American legal matters don't affect my claim to my grandson. Actually, they do, Wells replied. Your daughter Paloma McKenna legally adopted American citizenship when she married an Apache scout working for the U.S. Army. That makes her son an American citizen under federal protection. McKenna. Don Carlos's face went white. You said her name was Paloma McKenna. Ayanna stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Paloma took my Christian name when we married. In your legal system, she became Paloma Gabriel McKenna. The Don stared at his son-in-law in shock. Gabriel McKenna, but that would make you Thomas McKenna's brother. Sarah finished the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Tom was Gabriel's adopted brother. They grew up together after Gabriel was taken to the mission school. The revelation sent shockwaves through everyone present. Tom and Ayanna were brothers, one white, one Apache, both victims of the same conspiracy. Thomas wrote to me about his Apache brother. Sarah continued, her voice filled with wonder. He said Gabriel was the finest man he'd ever known, but that they'd lost touch when Gabriel returned to his people. He never knew Gabriel had married Paloma. Ayanna was staring at Sarah with amazement. Thomas spoke of me after all these years. He said you taught him everything worth knowing about honor and courage. Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. He said he hoped someday to be worthy of calling you brother again. The emotional revelation seemed to diffuse much of the tension in the canyon. Even the soldiers had lowered their weapons, caught up in the human drama unfolding before them. Judge Wells stepped forward with gentle authority. Given these circumstances, I believe we can resolve this situation equitably. Captain Thorne will face federal trial for his crimes. The Apache Nation will receive compensation for violations of treaty rights. And the child? He looked at Little Star sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. The child will remain with his chosen family. Chosen family, Don Carlos protested weakly. The woman who saved his life and the uncle who shares his father's blood. Wells replied. In frontier law, family is defined by love and protection, not just blood. Chief Cochise urged his horse forward, studying Sarah with those penetrating dark eyes. White woman, you would truly take this child as your own. Raise him to know both his heritages. I would be honored to, Sarah replied simply. He's already my son in every way that matters. The great chief nodded slowly. Then let it be so. But know this, an Apache child raised by a white mother will face challenges from both worlds. Are you prepared for such a burden? We're prepared to face it together, Ayanna said, moving to stand beside Sarah. As a family. The word hung in the air, rich with possibility and promise. Sarah looked at this man who had appeared at her door just days ago as a desperate stranger, and saw instead the partner she'd never dared hope for, someone who understood loss, who valued courage, who would fight beside her for what mattered most. Together, she agreed, reaching for his hand. Don Carlos made one final attempt. This is madness, a Mexican nobleman's grandson raised by Apache savages and frontier peasants. What will society think? Society, said Grandmother Moon with ancient wisdom, has never understood the true meaning of family. Perhaps it is time they learned. Judge Wells began the process of sorting out the legal complexities. But Sarah found herself focusing on simpler things: the feel of little Star's warm weight against her chest, the strength of Ayana's hand in hers, the promise of a future built on love rather than obligation. As the sun reached its zenith over the canyon of dancing spirits, something miraculous happened. The ancient rock formations seemed to shimmer in the heat, creating the illusion of movement, as if the stones themselves were swaying to some unheard music. Birds that had been silent during the confrontation began to sing again, their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to celebrate peace restored to sacred ground. "The spirits dance," Nulnish said with wonder. "They approve of what has been decided here." Captain Thorne, disarmed and under guard, made one last bitter comment. "You think you've won something here. This conspiracy goes deeper than one corrupt officer. There are men in Washington who won't let this stand." "Let them come," Sarah replied with quiet confidence. "We have the truth, we have each other, and we have something they'll never understand, a family forged by choice rather than convenience." As if to punctuate her words, Little Star opened his eyes and gazed up at the faces surrounding him: his Apache father, his chosen mother, his grandfather and uncle. All the unlikely family that had come together to protect him. He reached up with one tiny hand grasping at the air, as if trying to catch the dancing light that played across the canyon walls. "What will you call him?" Chief Cochise asked. "He will need a name that honors all his peoples." Sarah looked at Ayana, and in his eyes saw the same thought that had occurred to her. "Star," she said softly. "Star McKenna Gabriel. A name that belongs to no single people, but to all who choose to claim him." The baby Star gurgled happily at the sound of his new name, as if he approved of this decision about his identity. Months later, Sarah would look back on that moment in the canyon of dancing spirits as the true beginning of her life. Not the desperate flight from her empty ranch, not even the night a wounded Apache warrior had knocked on her door with a dying baby. But this moment when love triumphed over law, when family became a choice rather than an accident of birth. The ranch they eventually built was different from the one Tom had envisioned, smaller perhaps, but richer in the ways that mattered. Ayana proved as skilled with horses and cattle as he was with tracking and survival. Star grew strong and healthy, learning to speak Apache and English and Spanish with equal fluency, moving between worlds with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere because he was loved everywhere. Grandmother Moon became a frequent visitor, teaching Star the old stories, and Sarah the herbal wisdom of the desert. Chief Cochise, before his death several years later, formally adopted Star into the Apache Nation, while acknowledging his right to choose his own path. Even Don Carlos, his pride eventually overcome by grandfather's love, began sending gifts and letters from Mexico. The gold beneath the sacred canyon was never mined. Judge Wells saw to that, using Tom's documentation to expose the conspiracy and protect Apache treaty rights. Captain Thorne spent years in federal prison along with several highly placed officials whose dreams of easy wealth had led them into corruption and murder. But on that day in the Canyon of Dancing Spirits, as the various parties began to disperse and normal life slowly reasserted itself, Sarah McKenna held her chosen son and marveled at the strange paths that had led them all to this moment of grace. An Apache warrior had come begging for milk and in return had given her everything she'd lost and more than she'd ever dreamed of finding: love, family, purpose, and the courage to fight for what mattered most. As they prepared to leave the sacred canyon, Star riding contentedly in his pack cradle, while Ayana led their horse and Sarah walked beside them, she found herself thinking about the future with excitement rather than fear. There would be challenges ahead, there always were on the frontier, but they would face them together, this unlikely family bound not by blood or law or tradition, but by the strongest force in the human heart, the choice to love without reservation, to protect without counting the cost, to build something beautiful from the ruins of what had been lost. Behind them, the canyon of dancing spirits shimmered in the afternoon heat, its ancient stones bearing witness to another generation learning the eternal truth that family real. Family was not about who you were born to, but who you chose to stand with when the storms of life threatened to tear everything apart. And in the desert wind that followed them home, Sarah could swear she heard the sound of laughter. Paloma's laughter, Tom's laughter, The voices of all those who had loved them enough to bring them together across every boundary that divided their worlds. The dance of spirits continued eternal and joyful in the hearts of those brave enough to choose love over fear, hope over despair, family over everything else the world might offer. Star McKenna Gabriel would grow up knowing he was the child of that dance, the living proof that some bonds transcended every difference, every barrier, every reason why love should be impossible. He was possible. They were all possible. And that, Sarah thought as they rode toward home, was the greatest miracle of all.